again, thank you for all for being here today. Our speaker is Brandon Seale, and he is going to be talking about Cabeza de Vaca. And he, many of you may know him from his podcast, A New History of Old Texas. I know that that's where I first encountered his research. Braden's a member of the Texas Business Leadership Council, and he's an alumni of the Texas Lyceum and also a director at the Texas State Historical Association. He was a co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Texas Journal of Oil, Gas, and Energy Law at the University of Texas, where he earned his MBA and law degrees. And Brandon's podcast, A History of Oil in Mexico. I'm going to have to check that one out. I haven't listened to that one. And A New History of Old Texas have been downloaded more than 800,000 times. I'm at least, two or three of those times. Um, and this work that he's done on one of the seasons, he's really focused on the Battle of Medina, which would be one of the biggest and bloodiest battlefields in Texas history. Brandon's documentary trilogy is also entitled A New History of Old Texas, and it premiered on KLRN in San Antonio in September of 2025. So, Brandon, thank you so much for sharing your research with us.
Well, thanks for the invitation. Anything I can do to support you guys, and thanks for logging in to listen to me. So normally when I give these Texas history talks, usually people are more familiar with the Texas history piece or the Cabeza de Vaca piece or something like that, and maybe less familiar with the rock art. So this is interesting for me too, that like it may be a little bit of reverse. I've got an audience here that I suspect is more familiar than the average with the rock art of the Lower Pecos. And so I'll lean in a little bit more into the story of Cabeza de Vaca to set the context for what Karen alluded to, which is that I think we can see evidence of Cabeza de Vaca having encountered some of these stories that we see retold in the rock art of the Lower Pecos. And so it serves as almost like a piece of found footage for this living, breathing tradition, which of course, as we all know, still continues to this day in our part of the world. And so let's start this story of Cabeza de Vaca at the end. So I put us here in 1536. Four horsemen are surveying the Sinaloa River Valley in April of 1536, and they see out in the distance 13 figures walking toward them. And two of the figures, they can tell almost immediately, are not Native Americans. One of them is a black African Moor, as he's called, and the other is a Spanish nobleman. And as they try and figure out what they're looking at, they just fall speechless. And so these two figures from the 13 keep approaching, and they come closer. And again, the four horsemen are just slack-jawed and unable to say anything until finally it's the Spanish nobleman who speaks first, and he introduces himself. He says, "I'm Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, treasurer of the Narvaez expedition of 1527. Take me to your leader." And so it's hard to imagine, or I like to try to imagine, to put myself in those shoes of, what does that moment feel like? And that's why this is the great cinematic moment. And most of the treatments of the stories, or even the novellic treatments, it's always this moment of reunion that we treat as kind of like the climax of the story. Because what we're seeing with Cabeza de Vaca is, he's survived 9 years in the New World. So it's been 9 years since they left the Iberian Peninsula. 8 years since his expedition had kind of landed in Florida. 7 years since they got shipwrecked on Galveston Island. 5 years since they got reunited with each other. There's by now only 4 survivors of the 600-man expedition. 4 years since they kind of make their escape from South Texas across northern Mexico and up into the El Paso area and such like this, down all the way to the western coast of Mexico. 3 years since they started that trek down the coast of the Pacific Ocean. 2 years since they became the instruments of a catalog of miracles unmatched since Galilee in the 0 to 30 of the Common Era. Including the hand-to-God resurrection of a dead man and the surgical extraction of an arrowhead from the heart of another long-suffering Indian. And one of the great things about this story of Cabeza de Vaca, too, is that it's been depicted so much in art that you can tell this story, partly using the art that others have been moved to create to do so. And so I'll try and feature some of those here as I talk. And the documentary that we're producing about this, which this is basically a dry run of, actually features a lot of high resolution images that have been created over the years by famous artists like Tom Lee, who created this one here, the moment of the surgical extraction of the arrowhead. And so I want to start a little bit with a quote from Cabeza de Vaca that I think sets the tone for some of his attitude and his approach toward this entire journey. It's, you don't want to say it's indifference, but it's what it looks the most like actually is, if you're familiar with Jesuit theology, Ignatian theology, it's acatamiento. It's abiding. It's abiding all the things that his God or fate or whoever throws at him. And it becomes a posture that he takes in the new world as he's traveling through it. You know, by fortune's will, or more accurately through no one's fault, but solely through the will and wisdom of God, one person performs a greater service than he'd ever hoped, and another finds just the opposite. The latter may be able to give no more evidence of his purpose than his having attempted to fulfill it. And even this at times remains so obscure that he can't justify it by himself. And so, all right. So talk about Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. So he's a middling Spanish nobleman born in about 1490 in southern Spain, in Andalusia. He's born just in time to be raised on all the stories of 1492, which includes, of course, the conquest or the completion of the Reconquista, the Christian conquest of the southern part of Spain from the last Muslim kingdom, but also, of course, the discovery of the Americas. And so there's this enormous wealth flooding back into Spain, particularly southern Spain, Andalusia. Everything's flowing through Seville, which Cabeza de Vaca lives in at one point. His parents die young, but he actually gets attached to a very prominent and powerful noble household. He kind of follows the career track of a type A person of that century or of that time and place. He works as a steward in this royal household. He serves as a soldier over in Italy and then back in Spain. But by about 1526, 27, he's ready to make his mark. He's ready to get attached to one of these expeditions that are going to the new worlds and making men of modest means but immodest ambitions incredibly, incredibly wealthy. And so he gets assigned as the treasurer, which is basically the second in command of an expedition under a man named Pánfilo de Narváez in 1527, which is assigned the task of settling and effectively conquering the northern rim of the Gulf Coast. And so what that looks like is this map here, which I don't have in this presentation. Well, never mind. So they send him to the Gulf Coast, and the expedition is basically a disaster from the start. So originally it's 600 men and women, actually mostly men, but there are some families or some couples that leave. 600 that leave from the Iberian Peninsula in 1527. 140 of them abandon the expedition at the first port of call in the Caribbean. Another 60 die in a hurricane in Cuba when they're stationed in Cuba briefly to get supplies. It's the first European account of a hurricane, leaving only 400 or so to actually sail toward Florida. 100 stay on the ships, 300 disembark in Florida, and it's a catalog or a comedy of errors after that. They spend 6 months chasing around rumors of gold and corn. Corn for them is a proxy for an agricultural society, the kind of society that they're looking to be able to set themselves on top of as overlords. 60 men die in the course of their traipsing around Florida. And so that by November 1528, they're down to 240 men. And about a third of those are too ill to even move on their own. And so they're back on the Florida coast. They can't make contact with their ships at this point. To show you how confused they are, they actually still think they're on the eastern coast of Mexico. They're on the western coast of Florida watching the sunrise and sunset in the way the sun does, but they still don't even know which direction they're facing effectively. That's how disoriented they are by this whole experience. But the stragglers come up with a plan. They fashion rafts. They cut down tree trunks. They make a bellows. They blacksmith every piece of metal they have to make nails and bands. And they make these 5 rafts that are something like 30 feet long. We don't know how wide, but we assume they're not very wide. They pack them with asphalt pitch to try and make them waterproof. And they start floating along the rim of the Gulf Coast. Their bad luck follows them onto the Gulf, so they soon run out of water. And ironically, or coincidentally, they run out of water exactly as they're coming across the largest outflow of fresh water on the continent, basically the mouth of the Mississippi River. And so the Mississippi River then actually scatters them, all 5 rafts, out of sight of each other in the darkness. There's this like poignant scene where Cabeza de Vaca is asking the commander of the expedition, like, what do we do? We should tie up to each other. And the commander's last words are, "It's every man for himself at this point." Like, I'm not in command anymore. And sure enough, they would never see him again. And so at this point, the rafts are floating now out in the Gulf, beyond sight of land. The bodies of the men start to shut down. It's this really poignant scene. They're falling unconscious. There's maybe 40, 50 men in each raft. But by this point, there's only five, according to Cabeza de Vaca, that can even stand on their own feet. And then eventually it's just Cabeza de Vaca and the guy with the tiller. Until finally, on like the fourth night, they just pass out. But they're awoken on the morning of the fifth day by crashing into the Gulf Coast, the coast of Galveston Island, we think. And so they crash in there, and again, in a really kind of pathetic scene, their raft crashes. They try and push the raft back out into the ocean to keep going. And so they decide to take off their clothes to try and keep their clothes dry. So they throw those in the raft. And then as they're pushing the raft out into the surf flips it, crushes it, takes all their clothes. So now they are naked and cold and starving and alone on this island after 5 days of drifting. And anyway, here they are. And so then a really kind of improbable thing happens. They look up and all of a sudden they see 100 native Galvestonians looking down at them from the sand dunes. And there's this debate that happens amongst the men that so some of these men are veterans of Hernan Cortez's conquest of Mexico City, and they're raised on these stories of Aztec human sacrifice, and so they're debating like, do we fight them? Do we run away? Like what can we do? But it's frankly kind of a joke. They're also pathetic. Most of them can barely walk, and so Cabeza de Vaca does something different. And this is a big moment in the story where something changes, or maybe something in Cabeza de Vaca changes, where basically, you have this guy Cabeza de Vaca who's a conquistador's conquistador, raised on the stories of 1492. His grandfather actually was the conqueror of the Canary Islands. He realizes how vulnerable and utterly defenseless he is at that point. And so he approaches, he goes toward the 100 native Galvestonians standing there with their long bows and their impressive physiques, and he begs for help. Through hand signs, he explains what's happened to them and begs for their mercy and begs for their help. And the wildest thing is, not only do they understand him, they start to cry. The natives start to cry right there. And it's that moment that really brings home for Cabeza de Vaca, one, how pathetic his physical state truly is at this point, but two, just what a different environment he's entered at this point. That he's going to have to do things differently from this point forward. And he describes himself at about that point in the story as naked, desnudo como nací, as naked as I was born. And incidentally, this is a phrase that he's going to come back to. I forget the count, but it's something like 20 different times. It's one of the most commonly used words in his account of this expedition is desnudo or acueros. And so actually, on Monday, 2 days ago, I got to go to Texas State University, where Texas State has a first edition of this 1555 narrative written by Cabeza de Vaca. And I got to hold it with my hands. And I got to see this page right here, which is the page where he talks about how nos desnudásemos, like we made ourselves naked and we were desnudos. There's another mention of it here, and desnudos como nacimos. All these mentions of the word naked, which is not only a physical description, it's also meant to be kind of a spiritual description, metaphorical description of how he's vulnerable, how he's open to being changed, and kind of this posture that he's going to use to carry himself through this experience in the new world. So a couple days later, they actually find out that another raft had crashed nearby as well. And so they meet up with those survivors. Amongst those survivors are three other significant figures. We have Alonso Castillo, we have Andres Dorantes, and we have Esteban, who's probably the most enigmatic figure in this story. To be precise, Esteban is Andres Dorantes' slave. He's enslaved to Andres Dorantes. But Esteban has always kind of captured the hearts and the imaginations of people in this story, because it's Esteban that will always go first, ahead of these guys as they're traveling. And he seems to have some kind of preternatural ability with languages. He's always able to kind of make himself understood. And so by this point in the story, we have kind of the four main characters. And they still have another 50 or 60 Spanish castaways around them. Their numbers have not been reduced as severely yet as they will be later on. But in a terrible foreshadowing of things to come, only a few days after they land, their native hosts start to fall ill, and actually they start to fall sick too. There's some kind of disease starts running through the island, and so the native Galvestonians they put two and two together and basically just turn to the castaways and say, you must have brought this malady, like you need to fix it. And at first, and they even tell kind of Cabeza de Vaca and his castaway companions how to heal their suffering compatriots. That you need to basically breathe on the afflicted person and pass warm stones over their bodies and make small incisions with flints on their aching joints. And at first, Cabeza de Vaca and his men, they laugh, they snicker. And this is the direct quote is, quote, we laughed at this, saying that it must be a joke and that we didn't know how to heal people. And the response from the Galvestonian is, quote, an Indian told me that I didn't know what I was saying because the stones and other things that grow in the field have their own medicine. And that we as men certainly had more medicine and more power than these stones, which is great. It's like a challenge and it's a counterpoint. It's also, there's this debate going on in Spanish society at the time about whether Indians are gente de razón, people of reason. And here we see this Indian reasoning very logically kind of through this. Anyway, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions still remain skeptical, at which point the Galvestonians just put it to them in blunt terms, which is basically heal or get off the island. And so they go to work. So the castaways, they start, the way they know how. They start by saying some Our Fathers and Hail Marys and making the sign of the cross, but then they start incorporating these native rituals as well, the passing of the stones, the breathing, the incisions. They blow on them and they pray. They pray like they've never prayed before. And it worked. The sick Galvestonians, they rise up as good as new, like instantaneously. And there's no one that's more surprised by this than Cabeza de Vaca and his men. And this is, so there's a movie that was made of about Cabeza de Vaca in 1991 in Mexico with a Spanish director that is, it's good in some senses. It very much leans into the strangeness of the entire experience, the otherworldliness of it. A Land So Strange is the title of another book by Andres Reséndez, which is a great summary of the account of Cabeza de Vaca here. But the entire experience of having this cure work, this healing work, is deeply unsettling to Cabeza de Vaca and his companions. And also think about it too, like in the immediate aftermath of this syncretic ceremony where they've used Christian tradition and they've used native traditions, they can't be sure what's made it actually work. Like, was it the Padre Nuestros or was it the warm stones? And anyway, it becomes a strong argument for giving themselves over and being open to this experience. To encomendarse is the word that they use in the Spanish, which is like Jesus's last words on the cross is, in God, your Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It's that same root word. Encomendarse is like, commend. So this becomes also kind of their posture toward the faith experience that they're starting to relive too during this time. Okay, so unfortunately, so the numbers get dwindled down. So they go from 60 down to about 15 men is all that's left alive at this point on Galveston Island. And the remaining men decide in 1529, early 1529, that they got to get out of there. So 13 of them decide that they're going to march south. But Cabeza de Vaca and one other guy are too sick. They're too sick to travel, so they get left behind. And so Cabeza de Vaca at this point, describes basically his life for the next few years as something like slavery. It was that they were basically slaves living at the forbearance or the generosity of their native hosts. And the problem is they're not from this part of the world. They don't know how to hunt and gather. And so they get assigned the least desirable jobs of, digging cattail roots out of the marshes. And I mean, they're actually, they have to tend all the smoky fires that they light each night to keep the mosquitoes away. They're actually really delighted when they get the chance to scrape deer hides for the little bits of protein that they can salvage off of that. And so now, the reality too is that there's no indication that really the people amongst whom Cabeza de Vaca is living are living in any greater luxury or anything. But it definitely it becomes a life that Cabeza de Vaca feels like he can no longer live. And so by the summer of 1530, he actually leaves Galveston Island and goes to the mainland. And he discovers an interesting little job for himself. For the next 2 years, he becomes a trader, a merchant. And he talks about the goods that he's trading. It's mostly shells and hides. And red ochre is another one that he mentioned. So he takes seashells from the shore and carries them up inland. He gets deer hides and brings and red ochre and brings those back. And red ochre is an interesting clue for those of you who have been around the rock art and so latch onto that and we'll come back to that in a second. And so, but eventually by the spring of 1532, Cabeza de Vaca also is ready to leave. And so he convinces his companion. They start traipsing south. They march down the Texas coast and they make it maybe to about the Colorado River. And they run into some natives who tell them that, hey, actually, there's 3 more guys like you that are just down the way. and it's Alonso Castillo, Andres Dorantes, and Esteban. And so in late 1532, they get reunited. And when they do, actually, Andres Dorantes and presumably the other ones too, they think they're looking at a ghost. The quote from the Relación is, Andres Dorantes came out to see who it was. When he saw me, he was very frightened, since for many days they had thought I was dead, because the Indians had told him so. We gave many thanks to God for being together again, and that day was one of the happiest we enjoyed in all of our days. So, Cabeza de Vaca here, and at various points in the story, he reiterates almost like dogmatically kind of, principles of his faith. The way he says it here too is like, he had never doubted this day would come. His faith and the faith of his companions had taught them to believe this. And seeing the power of their faith, which has brought them back together after all this hardship by 1532, they decide that they're going to use their faith now to move themselves across the country. They've been out here for 4 or 5 years now, and they decide that they're going to leave their native hosts and take their chances. But they're not just going to show up as beggars or as slaves to each new native community they come across. They're going to show up as medicine men, as shamans. They're going to show up and conduct cures, which, if you think about it, is a pretty risky strategy. I mean, like, if you're going to be like a medicine man or a faith healer, you better be able to heal, and because being like a fraud is way worse than being a freeloader, which is what they had been before. But they try it. So sometime in the late summer of either 1533 or 1534, they meet up under the light of a South Texas full moon, and they start marching south. And they immediately run into a community of Native Americans. And Esteban goes first and tells them these are great faith healers. The natives bring out 4 or 5 of their ailing compatriots and challenge them to heal. And they do the same thing. They do the same kind of syncretic ceremony, the Padre Nuestros and the Ave Marias, and they combine it with the warm stones and the breathing and all these things. And again, it works. The long suffering natives rise up. They're healed. They're as good as new. And again, they're a little bit overwhelmed by this experience, by this power, or by this instrumentality that they've achieved. But what happens now is also different too, is that their grateful convalescents, they pay these 4 castaway shamans in the way that apparently medicine men were paid, which is basically with everything they own. They bring them this bounty of prickly pear mostly, but also something they hadn't seen in years. They don't recognize it at first, but venison. They bring them deer meat. And so these 4 castaways who have been starving for 4 or 5 years now suddenly have more food in front of them than they can do anything with. And so in a very like loaves and fishes kind of way, they give it all away. They give it all away. And that brings more people to them. All of a sudden, there's these 4 strange looking faith healers, wandering around the country, performing these miracle cures and giving away all of their honorariums and their bounties. And so their entourage and their fame starts to grow. And so suddenly, for the first time, really, they're actually moving now kind of under their own momentum. These people who have been stuck for 6 years in one spot, and their band grows to dozens, hundreds, and eventually thousands, according to the account. This is when they start bringing these really elaborate gifts to them, the copper rattles and little bags of silver and beads and red ochre and these kind of things. This is when Cabeza de Vaca raises the dead man from the dead. And so it becomes literally unbelievable at some point as you start reading through this. But anyway, their native companions, they start to call them the children of the sun. It's a term of art that they use to refer to these men that are coming from the east and traveling through them, conducting these cures. But neither the miracle cures that they're performing nor their celebrity is able to remove them from the grind to grind of daily existence in the South Texas brush, or even protect them from the elements, the more dangerous elements. And so there's this great story in Cabeza de Vaca that I want to spend a second on, and you'll understand why once I get to the end. But one winter afternoon, while out foraging, Cabeza de Vaca gets separated from his people. And then as night falls, he finds himself alone. So at this point, he's lost, he's hungry, he's cold. Once again, he uses the phrase, desnudo como nací, as naked as I was born. And as he's stumbling through the prickly South Texas terrain, however, in the darkness, he sees a glowing light off in the distance. And so he thinks it's a campfire at first. So he starts to head toward it. But as he gets closer, like, he hears no voices, he sees no forms. And once he finally gets up to it, he realizes that it's a burning bush. Like a burning bush, in case that resonates with anybody here, a burning bush in the middle of the South Texas brush, the South Texas monte. And so he goes toward it. He takes the flames from it. He lights 4 fires in the shape of a cross, he says. He digs himself a little hole in the middle of it and covers himself with grass, to keep warm. And that's where he sleeps that night. That night and for 4 more nights to come. Every day during the day, he'll take 2 torches, he says, and he'll light the torches and carry them with him as he travels through the wilderness looking for his people. But every night he'll dig a hole again and light 4 fires and go back to sleep. But finally, on the fourth night, there's a spark falls into his hole with his grass bedding and lights it on fire. And so he wakes up in this blaze and he's on fire. His hair's on fire. He's charred and scarred. He's rising up from this hole and coming out of it. But sure enough, on that fifth day, he finds his native band. He finds Castillo and Dorantes and Esteban. He's reunited with them and they're overjoyed. And he tells them this story. But for those of you who have been to enough of these Shumla Lunch and Learns, I hope there were parts of that story that sounded pretty interesting or sounded pretty familiar. And it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that at this point in Cabeza de Vaca's journey, he is directly in northern Coahuila, we think, at this point in his story, right in the heartland of where you have these stories that have been told by native traditions over all these years. And so, I want to draw your attention to the ways that, like, you've got this fire ceremony, deeply embedded in Mesoamerican, but even North American traditions here too, with these 4 fires kind of lit on all sides, like Cabeza de Vaca was talking about. I mean, the image of walking around with the 2 torches. I couldn't help but read that the first time and think of, like this image from White Shaman or some of these other works that we've seen. The idea of this flaming figure emerging from a hole in the ground also sure sounds really familiar to some of these, birth of creation or even some of these other, Mesoamerican imagery around this kind of grandfather fire type figure. And so the the question, for Cabeza de Vaca is, to what extent is he familiar with these stories? I don't know. I mean, it has to be a little bit of speculation. But there's another interesting detail from Cabeza de Vaca's account that I think links him to some of these stories. So I want to jump ahead to this one a little bit here. Yeah, so I mean, this is Cabeza de Vaca is right about here, we think, in his story when he tells the story. Yeah, just another perspective here. The Serranía del Burro. This I'm sure you guys have all seen, right? The rendering, the timeline, the ancientness of it. Okay, so the other clue that Cabeza de Vaca offers us, well, and let me back up. I think some of the supposition from the work of Shumla and others is that the visual tradition depicted in the rock art of the Lower Pecos has some Uto-Aztecan, Proto-Uto-Aztecan vocabulary or origin to it, that it seems to share imagery with some of these other traditions, Aztec, Hopi, Zuni, the Huichol, these kind of things. Well, in all of Cabeza de Vaca's travels, and in all of his narrative of his travels, he only leaves us with 2 Indian words, 2 native words that he feels like he should record. The first one is well, here's the quote. Among them is a language in which when they call men to look at something, they say araka, and for dogs, they say sho, X-O. It's a funny pair of words to remember from his journey, that, I mean, well, why are these two there? And I remember the first time I mentioned this to Dr. Boyd one time when we were having lunch. This was in San Marcos, 7 years ago. She stopped me and she said, you just told me what language they were speaking. And she clued me into something which you guys may already know, which is, I mean, sho is like the iconically Uto-Aztecan root for this word for dog. I mean, it's Xolotl then becomes, the god, the dog deity, guide to the underworld. That the Xolos, the Tijuana soccer team, I mean, it's the really hairless Mexican dog is the Xolo Exquitli, is like, it's a very Nahuatl and identifiably language piece of this language group that Shumla and others have been supposing has been connected to this rock art for a long time, which I think is a fascinating connection to it. The other thing I want to point out in terms of parallel imagery or parallel symbolism is this 5-day underworld journey, which I think we talk about when we interpret sometimes, the White Shaman. It's this idea of these 5 pilgrims. 5 is the sacred number, kind of in this tradition, And there's even from one of the early Spanish chroniclers in like 1548, Father Sahagún, he mentions that these 5 world underworld journeys. That's the iconic rebirth arc. In the same way that in the Christian tradition, like a 3-day resurrection arc is if anything happens over the course of 3 days in a piece of Western literature, like immediately your mind goes to the resurrection story, Jesus and whatever. Well, the 5-day resurrection story, I think, has some of the same valence here. I'm learning, and so think about Cabeza de Vaca. He's out wandering for 5 days from his. It makes you reconsider also too, frankly, the 5 days that he and his companions spent floating on the Gulf before their own watery underworld where they're laying. He says it 2 or 3 times in that account too, that they're laying like dead in the boat, and they emerge like dead on Galveston Island. Like there's a really lot of an uncanny amount of symbolism that seems to fit some of that interpretation. All right. Well, so the counterpart, another sense of the word shalotl is this twin. Shalotl is this twin, and again, this is coming from Schumla's work or from the publications of some of the stuff they've done. The twin is Quetzalcoatl. The twin is Quetzalcoatl, the god of light, and Shalotl is kind of the god of darkness. Going through the underworld, which also can't help but recall for me this really odd story in Cabeza de Vaca's narrative that otherwise interrupts his very linear narrative. He stops to give us this one Native American story that he talks about. And so I'm going to read it to you here in its entirety, and see if I can throw some images on the screen while I do so. So, quote, from the native's account, this story started 15 or 16 years ago. He's telling this at about the year 1535 in his journey. In case it's helpful, 1519 is a year that Tenochtitlan falls, and also when the Spanish actually reach as far north as the Rio Panuco. From the natives' account, it started 15 or 16 years ago. They told us that a man had gone about in that land whom they called Malacosa, short-haired, with a beard, though his face they could never clearly make out. Just before he arrived at someone's lodge, the occupant's hair would stand on end and they would tremble, and then suddenly Malacosa would appear in the doorway holding burning sticks. He would enter their lodge and take whatever he wanted from them. Then he would make 3 cuts into their sides with a very sharp rock. Then he would stick his hand into the incisions and remove their intestines, and he would cut off several inches and throw them into the fire. Then he would make 3 cuts onto their arm in the crook of the elbow and dislocate it. A short while later, he would reset the arm and place his hands over the wounds, and they told us that when he was done, everything healed right up. They said that many times when they were dancing in their religious ceremonies, he would appear, sometimes dressed as a woman, sometimes as a man, and that when he wanted to, he could pick up an entire lodge. They also said that many times they gave him food to eat, but that he never ate, and that when they asked where he came from and where he had his home, he pointed to a hole in the ground and said that his home was down below. So even just with the high level parameters of what I've given you of Cabeza de Vaca's story, I hope this sounds very clearly like Cabeza de Vaca talking about himself in the third person, and then he's deconstructing his own account effectively. It's the fully deconstructed version of his own account. I mean, there's not that many bearded people walking around North America at that time. So he's one of them. This idea of taking whatever he wants. So remember, the way he originally described it in his narrative is that they're giving these gifts. These are payments to these doctors, but is that really how they're seeing it? Maybe they are seeing it as Cabeza de Vaca and his companions taking these gifts. All this stuff about the healing and having it work right away. Well, Cabeza de Vaca makes it sound very miraculous and pure and clean. This is a lot more gruesome, what may be going on here. The stuff about giving him food to eat but never eating. Well, we already talked about this, that they offer food to Cabeza de Vaca and then he redistributes, and his companions, and they redistribute it to these people. And when they ask where his home was, he points to the ground and says that his home was down below. Well, who just told this story about digging a hole in the ground and emerging from it? The question that comes up a lot of times when I tell this story, the logical question is, is Cabeza de Vaca making this stuff up? Is he trying to write a literary account? And I think it's a fair question. And there's certainly elements of the way he writes this that do seem literary, as much so as he's also sometimes called the first Texas anthropologist, and he is in some ways, but he also is telling an incredible story. But I mean, I'll say this too, the odd specificity with which he remembers things, some things, being able to put exact dates on stuff and being able to put exact numbers on things. A more charitable interpretation may be that this is just how he encodes memory, that somehow along the way he learns that 5-day resurrection arcs are keys to a good story, And so he remembers that, and that's how he tells the story to his native companions, and that's how he remembers the story, or something like that. And another last clue to that is this last little story that I'll include here, but before I kind of wrap up. So, um, right before Cabeza de Vaca and his men and the three other castaways start their end run down the west coast of Mexico, they enter a town. And it's the town where they first see the evidence of Europeans, of other Spaniards. They see an Indian who has a horseshoe nail tied around his neck on a necklace. And for them, this is this moment of exultation. Like they think they're finally going to make it back to New Spain or whatever their goal was. Um, but the more important detail from that village is that village gives him 600 dried deer hearts. 600, that's a lot of deer hearts. 600 dried deer hearts, which he takes with him. And he kind of moves on past it for a moment. And so I'll follow the narrative trajectory here too to come back to that 600. We talked about how the natural, I think, inclination for us to read the story is to think of this moment of reunion with Spaniards, that film clip I started the presentation with, to think of that moment as the great climax of this story, right? That's really what we're kind of invested in at this point. But Cabeza de Vaca passes over that reunion in the most boringly bureaucratic detail. I mean, it's like, yep, we met them. I told them my name. I said I wanted to meet their captain, and we went and met their captain. Like, that's it. There's no context. There's no artfulness to it. But it's because I think, Cabeza de Vaca's view of the climax of his story isn't his reunion. It's what comes next. It's what comes after that. So by this point, when he reunites with these Castilians, these four horsemen, he has 600, that number, 600 native followers, according to his account, but behind him at this point. And he realizes pretty quickly that these four Castilian horsemen, they're not just explorers or harmless, whatever. They're slavers. They're out looking for Indian slaves. And there's something in this moment, too, that makes him recall these 600 deer hearts, these 600 Native American followers. And remember, you may remember, too, his 600 Spanish companions that he left the New World with. It's such an oddly large and precise and specific number that he repeats in those three contexts. The 600 people he leaves the Iberian Peninsula with, the 600 followers he has when he reunites with Castilians, and the 600 deer hearts. The symbolism of the deer hearts also, I think, can come out of some of the rock art of the Lower Pecos. So, the deer is the ultimate intermediary sacrificial figure, and the heart of the deer. I mean, this is what's being delivered or exchanged when the deer is being sacrificed. And Cabeza de Vaca similarly, and think about that parallel. I mean, this is the other clue that the climax of Cabeza de Vaca's story isn't reunion. It's got to be a moment of sacrifice. Sacrifice sits at the center of the Christian tradition. It sits at the center of this old world cosmology that he started to interpret. And so, sure enough, he jumps in the way of the slavers and prevents them from enslaving his 600 followers. And he tells the followers, he tells them to flee into the hills, that they need to run away or whatever. And the Castilians try and stop him. They say, no, like don't listen to this Cabeza de Vaca guy. Like, he's just like us. He's a Castilian like us. In fact, if anything, he's like a down on his luck version of us. And before Cabeza de Vaca can actually counter, one of his native companions takes the metaphorical microphone out of his hand and counters for him. You're wrong, they tell the slavers. Cabeza de Vaca and Esteban and Castillo and Dorantes had, quote, come from where the sun rises, and that the slavers had come from where it sets. They'd come from the Pacific Ocean, and that we, the Cabeza de Vaca and his companions, had healed the sick, and that they, the slavers, only killed those who were healthy, and that we came naked and barefoot, and that they came with horses and lances, and that we had not a greedy bone in our body, and that in fact everything we got we had turned around and given to them, leaving nothing for ourselves, whereas they had no other goal than to rob them of everything they had, and had never given anything to anyone. This is the mic drop moment of the narrative. And what's fascinating about this piece too, the former president of Trinity University pointed this one out to me, that whole paragraph I just quoted you is a grammatical mess. Like, if you turn that into a high school English teacher, they'd mark it up, because the pronouns keep switching. The perspective keeps switching throughout that entire passage. It's from Cabeza de Vaca to his companions to the slavers and then back again. He's like author and narrator and interlocutor and subject and object all at once. And so, Cabeza de Vaca, by the end of his journey, has become the stories that he's telling. And so I want to wrap up here, partly because this is like the teaser to actually watch the documentary when it comes out on KLRN later this year, because you'll have to dial in to see how we tie it all together. And part of the clue is, I think it is through his faith again. His faith is what allows him to approach stories that he doesn't understand, but that he believes matter anyway, and that's really some core a beautiful understanding of faith that I think we can learn from. But I also think too, like the Cabeza de Vaca's count can be read as a really exciting interpretive validation of some other clues that we've had in interpreting the rock art and in seeing the continuity of its practice from 6,000 years ago right down to the present. So I'll stop there. Thank you, and we'll do some questions. Oh, I guess let me offer this while people are thinking of a
Mhm.
question, because this is often a question is like, so what happens to Cabeza de Vaca? So he does make it back to Spain like the next year, 1537. And talk about a guy who deserved a vacation, deserved a break. He immediately goes to the king and tries to get an appointment to come back as the governor of Spanish North America. By then, they've already given it, though, to Hernando de Soto. And so instead, they give him the governorship of what later becomes Argentina, Rio de la Plata. And it's a complicated ending. It's a complicated next chapter of his life. So he goes to Rio de la Plata, becomes governor, and for one, he doesn't win any friends immediately with some of the other Castilians because of his weird quirks he's picked up. Like he doesn't like to wear shoes. Like he in some cases is very charitable toward native South Americans. But like we shouldn't gloss it over. He never stops being a servant of the king. And so, for example, when some natives do oppose him, under the laws of the king, if you're at war with the king, you can be imprisoned by the king. And he does take Indian slaves down in South America. And eventually he's actually shipped back to Spain in chains, more from Castilian opposition to some of the things he was doing. He's charged with criminal neglect of his official duties. He spends a lot of the rest of his life defending himself against these charges. I mean, actually, this book is published partly as part of his defense, his PR campaign to defend his reputation. And I like the fact that in the most he ends up dying in what seems to be the most improbable of ways for a guy of his life, like in his bed in his hometown at like 70 years of age. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting story. I mean, I can't imagine, just sort of the experiences that he had. So we do have
Here,
some
so yeah, so
questions.
I'll answer these. So the name of the documentary will be A New History of Old Texas, Cabeza de Vaca. Oh, sorry, the one last year was Battle of Medina. And so Battle of Medina is out. We have a second one coming out in July, The Republic of the Rio Grande, and this will be the third that comes out. And then the fourth one for later this year will be about the Lipan Apaches. Like I saw Gary's name on here somewhere too. Like I need to catch up with him. We haven't started that one yet. We got to finish this one up first, but that's the four we're trying to make. Was the place where the 600 deer hearts were given to Cabeza de Vaca Corazones? Yes, that's exactly it. Valle de los Corazones. Yep, and it's a stopping point that they go back on. So the only one of these four castaways that ever goes back to North America is Esteban. Esteban ends up on it's like the immediate predecessor to the Coronado expedition, the Marcos de Niza expedition, which goes up a year before Coronado. And I, the official account is that he's playing his role. He's sent ahead. He's kind of the vanguard, preparing the way for the Spanish expedition, and that he ends up. I think it's somewhere in Arizona, maybe is the speculation, near a Zuni village, and he gets killed by the inhabitants. That they fill him full of arrows, is how the account goes. But I think too technically. The chronicler never saw the body, so there's actually a novelized version of Esteban's life called The Moor's Tale, which ends with him disappearing back into Native America and just kind of becoming a medicine man there and raising a family. And so anyway, it's yeah. Uh, did Cabeza de Vaca's catalog of miracles include any strange happenings in the environment around him? Not. Uh, no, I don't think so. So there's a relatively new paper that came out from Donald Olson at Texas State, um, which has you can tell just has the story all covered up between the first edition, Carolyn's there now and Donald Olson and some of these other ones. But he does like an astronomical interpretation of he's trying to read into Cabeza de Vaca's account and using astronomical clues about timing about when they did things. And so he has like a new interpretation about when they start their faith healing journey based on the lunar calendar and the Catholic calendar. But I don't remember any mentions of any like astronomical or other physical anomalies. I hope I'm not forgetting something. Nothing jumps to mind. Sorry.
So I have a question. I know there are like different proposed routes for
Yeah.
Cabeza de Vaca, and there's like, um, we're they're pretty sure they came through that southern route. Because I always think about, how close did he get to the Lower Pecos?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
yeah.
so in general, the more scholarly accepted route is the red one. There's actually another good paper. A paper came out from Texas State folks a few years back that talks about like the history of the route proposals.
Mhm.
And really, these kind of blue and green routes can in large part be chalked up a little bit to like Texas nationalism. Like there was a was it Halleck or Hallenbeck, I can't remember the scholar, who like really wanted a trans Texas route. And so there's a couple people that did that. But also, this is an interesting point too, is that particularly in the 30s and the 40s, when some of these routes are being theorized, these are not people that have easy access to some of the Spanish language accounts and interpretations that are going on too. I mean, there are accounts from the late 1500s and early 1600s of native groups that are remembering the visit of Cabeza de Vaca and these other three men. There's some in Nuevo Leon, up in this area, and there's some up in this area. So there's pretty strong reason to believe the red one is probably the better route. The other anchor points that people have felt pretty comfortable with are, well, Corazones is one. And then the other one here is the Presidio Ojinaga. Like that was a major settlement at the time. And there's strongly theorized that that's where, and you can see even these various routes kind of pass through here too. So yeah, in our documentary, we won't really go into the debate on the different routes. We'll kind of just
No,
accept
yeah.
the red one. But I will note that even the green one would have worked pretty well for this theory. You know?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Um, yeah, there's a question, did they make it into Arizona?
No, I don't think so. There are some older interpretations of it, and I know that there's artistic traditions in Arizona and New Mexico that have attached to this story. There's a great artist in Arizona we were talking about beforehand, Ted de Grazia, who's from Arizona, who did a whole series of paintings on these things. But um, I don't think the scholarship these days thinks he quite that he passed through Arizona. I don't know, maybe the very southern tip there. Like yeah.
Yeah. And then there's another question. I don't know if you see it there at the end. Could you expand a bit about the Quetzalcoatl dualism and the rock art?
Yeah, and I'm not the probably the right person to do that. I mean, what that's meant to be is a segue into this really interesting story that Cabeza de Vaca tells about his twin, his dark twin, his doppelganger, like his evil twin. And it recalls to mind this notion that of Xolotl as a twin counterpart figure, a darkness of light, god of darkness to a god of light to Quetzalcoatl. And so, yeah, I can't speak too intelligently about
Mhm.
that specific connection.
Yeah, I mean, I know in the rock art we see a lot of dualism as far as, from a preservation point of view, we might have one figure that is we see a lot of symmetry. And so we'll look and we'll see a figure that we can see better. And then we'll start looking on the other side because it's almost like we expect to have that dualism
Yeah,
the other side.
fascinating.
So
All
that's
right,
kind
so
of it.
I see a couple interesting notes here too.
Yeah.
Uh, Similarities between de la Vaca, Cabeza de Vaca shamanism and Mississippian shamanism. For example, the
Mhm.
notion that he came from underground, works with this iconography, and so yeah, I definitely can't speak on this. The Shuma folks would be better at that, but I mean, I have heard Carolyn and others talk about that there's this idea of some kind of pan New World cosmology that may be shared in some of this imagery and so yeah, I mean, I will say that like culturally, I do think there's a dividing line that cuts right across Texas and it has to do with rainfall and it has to do with things that still divide Texas culturally and historically and stuff too. And from about the Colorado River on west, it feels a lot closer to Mesoamerican kind of things. The trade routes are Mesoamerican. They're trading tropical feathers. Cabeza de Vaca even mentions at one point, and we have evidence of like strong cultural affinities there versus kind of the eastern parts of the state, certainly are Mississippian and see that influence. And um, so I don't know, but maybe it spans both of those things. And yeah, yes, to your point about the five cardinal directions. Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely an idea. There's even a term in Nahuatl for this idea of like four objects, and the fifth object is the group of the objects, like a fist, you know. So there's something interesting to think about that, right? Of like Cabeza de Vaca is one of four, and they're traveling, and together they're a group is like a fifth. If we pulled up like the Fate Bell image, you know, like the pilgrims and stuff like that, like there's, it certainly seems like he's incorporating, he's been influenced by some kind of native numerology.
Right, yeah, like the rock art often has five.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
yes.
Exactly. And again, if 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 he's really remembering the way if he's using it to encode things, like why wouldn't it be a 3 day? Well, and he does use Christian encoding. I mean, basically, they land in Florida on Good Friday, 1527, and he doesn't quite say they were saved on Easter in 1536 or reunited in Easter, but like there's a lot of calendar clues to suggest it's pretty damn close to Easter. You know, like so he is using both registers, I think, in how he talks about these things. I
Yeah,
see
and
where
I
he
don't
is.
know, yeah, and I don't know that much about is I mean, basically what I know about Cabeza de Vaca is what you have taught me, but I believe I remember you saying something about and doesn't in his chronicles, doesn't he start with like more of the Christian references and
Yeah.
then as it goes it changes more to the
These
indigenous
these very
perspectives and
classic, you know, faith healing deeds and this loaves and fishes moment and like the resurrection of the Lazarus man, the burning bush are all kind of like earlier in the story. And then, you know, as he travels along and really takes on this kind of shaman role is when, in that moment, that getting lost in the South Texas brush for 5 days is kind of the moment where you start to see more of these native numerology and these other clues, these other stories start to take over more, you know. And so I do think that's interesting, you know, that like as he goes deep, as he's reborn into this tradition, sort of, you know, he takes on that iconography a little bit more.
yeah.
I don't know who Kekopeli is. I'm being asked here. Any parallels to Kekopeli? Who's that?
I think it's probably a reference to Kokopelli, the flute player that is found more north, like in like New Mexico and Utah. I don't
No, I
um
don't know about that. I will. The one interesting connection to like I think it's Zuni. Zuni
oh
tradition
it's
has some of these these dolls, these Kachina dolls, maybe they're called Kachina
mhm.
dolls, that are dark skinned, looking figures, and so at least one person has posited that maybe that's some institutional memory of Esteban. You know, like I'd say
Right.
it's pretty attenuated, but someone else has theorized that. I won't put that out.
Mhm. Yeah.
Kekopeli traitor. I don't know what that is. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
the humpback
Yeah,
player
yeah.
image. Okay.
Yeah.
No, sorry, I don't know anything about that. I don't know how to speak to that. Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely mention of music. By the way, there's definitely mentions of the use of psychedelic or other intoxicating substances and rituals and
Mhm.
practices, you know, often described around these events and stuff. You know, he talks at one point pretty clearly about something which we think is what's the black tea, the Ilex vomitoria or whatever. There's
I like the holly,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. There's he's very much around these kind of ceremonies and stuff
Yeah.
like that too. So
And I'm not as knowledgeable. I mean, for people who are on the call, I mean, I'm a chemist, but I hang out with people who do interpretation. But I know that, you're probably looking at some different language groups and things like that as well. And so,
well,
while some
yeah,
of this is Pan-American, there will be probably some differences as
and you know,
groups separate.
Carolyn and I have talked about this and have started kind of informally documenting all the different times that we find mentions of a Nahuatl speaker in really exaggerated geographies. Like there's one in Kansas maybe it's Coronado's expedition encounters. You know, like
Mhm.
there's some idea that there's some kind of it's some kind of lingua franca. So, you know, some kind of Nahuatl.
Yeah.
You know, would make sense. The first when I first saw that word Cocopelli, there's a Nahuatl word for their merchants that they use that I can't remember what it is, that these Aztec merchants that are clearly traveling far and wide, you know,
Okay, maybe that's what they meant with that
and
term.
maybe transacting, you know, in some kind of because
Mhm.
because there's this direct quote, you know, here actually, Cabeza de Vaca talks about, you know, that there's a plenitude of languages. Oh, and by the way, thinking again of this is think of in the book of Acts. You hear this too. Here we go. We came
Cheka.
across a great variety and number of languages, and God our Lord favored us with a knowledge of all of it because they always could understand us and we them. When we asked, they would answer by signs as if they spoke our tongue and we theirs. Like book of Acts, there's something like that in book of Acts. I can't quite remember Luke or one of them. But yeah, but there's a different clause that does suggest that there's certainly like Plains Indian, like there's some kind of hand language that does serve as a little bit of a lingua franca, but he makes some passing mention that makes it sound like there is also some kind of the Puchteca somebody mentioned. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, and then, I do want to clarify on this question. It says, are you saying that some of the petroglyphs are documenting Cabeza?
Yeah.
And no, we're not. Yeah, we're saying that the pictographs are depicting the worldview of the indigenous people who Cabeza de Vaca interacted with, and so that
It's
he
the
would
idea that
have
like
understood what the images were depicting.
that I think some of their stories are reflected through Cabeza de Vaca's own narrative in interesting ways, and precisely because, as Lisa M points out, I think he makes himself naked, he makes himself impressionable, and makes
Mhm.
allows himself to be an instrument of his God's will, and it's
Yeah.
nakedness, encantamiento, and these other things all together.
No, it's amazing survival story. I always,
Yes.
you
Well, and it's
know,
one of those things too that I've probably read this thing a dozen times, and like you can return to it at different points in life and read it in different ways. You can read it as a survival story. You can read it as a resume, that he's trying to report on. You can read it as a religious allegory, very much so. Like it's just an infinitely rich text, and I particularly like the idea that we're kind of coming to in this work of like Cabeza de Vaca is, for better or worse, is often approached as like an origin story of Texas history, which is unfortunate in the sense that it then overwrites and neglects 30, 15, 17, 30,000 years of human history before that in Texas. But to the extent maybe we think of Cabeza de Vaca as like the New Testament, the beginning of the New Testament, of a reinterpretation of an older set of books, of an older set of stories that I think Cabeza de Vaca is doing in a set of stories documented in the rock art. That's a really rich and exciting idea for Texas history.
want to thank everyone for attending, and we do these every month, and I thank you all for today, and thank you, Brandon.
My
So,
pleasure. And if you want the 11-hour version of this, go look up my podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get podcasts,
mhm.
and you can hear more. So.